story that you are about to see is historically correct, and it is based upon my book titled The Great Baltimore Fire, published by the Maryland Historical Society, and it is based on the extensive research that went into this book. Come with me on this journey. This is Pete Peterson, Professor of Management at Johns Hopkins University and author of the book, The Great Baltimore Fire. With us today is Wayne Schaumburg, Baltimore historian. How did the fire start?
Well, that's one of the most interesting questions of all, because we're really not 100% sure how the fire got going. The pretty much accepted story to the fire is that the fire was accidental. It was caused by possibly a careless smoker walking down in front of the Hearst building and flicking away a cigarette butt that may have fell through a broken eye in a street skylight and fallen into the basement of the Hearst building, where it smoldered all night. And then by Sunday morning around 10:30, the fire had gotten big enough in the basement that it set off an automatic alarm, and that brought the fire companies to the building, and the Great Baltimore Fire was off and running.
Tell us, what was the role of smoke explosions and backdrafts throughout the Great Baltimore Fire?
The smoke explosion and the backdraft were the factor that caused this fire initially to spread as quickly as it did. The Hearst building, when the firemen arrived, engine company 15 and truck company 2, if I remember my equipment right, Captain Call looked at the annunciator. The building had an annunciator on the outside that indicated the fire was in the basement. They pried open the front doors of the building to get in and went across the first floor to look down, and sure enough, the fire had worked its way across the basement and then was going up the elevator shafts. Now, in 1904, unlike nowadays, elevator shafts were wide open. So the smoke was allowed to simply go up the elevator shaft and then basically build in the top of the building. And Captain Call, when he went in with his men, one of the things that he said he heard, it sounded like doors were being closed upstairs, like somebody was closing doors. And what he quickly realized was that this backdraft was building, and that when he had opened the door to let his men in, he had let in the oxygen. So immediately he told these guys to get out, and he barely got them out in time because the building exploded shortly after. And when the building exploded, not only were all the windows blown out, but the roof was blown away, and the debris from the roof went across the intersection and landed on 5 or 6 other buildings. So hence, instead of one building on fire, we now have 5 or 6 on fire, and the Great Baltimore Fire was off and running.
Well, at the time of this explosion, I understand that a horse was a hero. Tell us that story.
The horse's name was Goliath, and he arrived pulling one of the towers that was used by the fire department for putting out fires. He was part of, I believe, a 3-team hitch that arrived, and the equipment with Goliath being one of the horses pulling it arrived just as the hearse building exploded. And the enormous explosion, of course, spooked the horses, and when that happened, the horses literally kind of panicked and galloped away, saving the equipment. But as debris came off the building, it hit Goliath in the hind quarter, and he was injured, but not injured badly enough to prevent him from continuing to run back and forth and bring in equipment. After the fire, everybody knew the story of Goliath, and he kind of becomes the equine hero of the Baltimore City Fire Department. And for years afterwards, whenever there were parades, old Goliath was always in the parades or leading the parades. He died in June of 1913. I was looking at this today, and interestingly enough, the Baltimore Sun gave Goliath a 6-paragraph obituary, which was more press than most of the other deaths that had occurred that day in the Sun. But he's quite a story. He was buried north of Baltimore on a farm, which pretty much county historian John McGrain thinks is about the area of York Road and Seminary Avenue.
Adding to that story, I think it's interesting, it's almost a miracle that when Goliath made that U-turn on Liberty Street and headed the other direction, that the wagon was able to clear because the street was so narrow. Liberty Street was so narrow, and the wagon was so long. It
So they were very lucky.
A close shave.
Yep, close shave, right.
Chief Horton, one of the best in the nation at the time, a man that you would want to have in charge during an urban fire.
Sure.
Unfortunately, he ran into a mishap. Tell us about that.
Right. Chief Horton lived just on the other side of the downtown district. So when the fire broke out, he lived just east around the area of the shot tower. So this was a Sunday morning. Apparently he put on his coat and came over to see what was going on. And he got there a little after 11, so the hearse company had already exploded. And within 20-30 minutes did a quick assessment of the fire and was very concerned that this fire had the potential of getting out of hand. 5 or 6 buildings are burning now. The wind's beginning to play tricks with this fire. And so basically Horton did 2 things pretty much by noon. One was to order the calling of a general alarm, bringing all the city's fire equipment from the 24 houses downtown to be ready. And the second thing he did was he ordered the sending of a telegram from Baltimore to Washington, and the contents of the telegram was very succinct, simply, big fire here, must have help at once. So this was really the first plea for help outside of Baltimore. Horton was an experienced fire chief. Back in those days, the chief was called the chief engineer. He knew his business backwards and forwards. Unfortunately, not long after this had happened, he was struck by a falling trolley wire and was badly burned on the shoulder and was taken to a nearby hospital to be treated, and pretty much was out of commission for pretty much the rest of the fire.
Yes.
And was succeeded by August Emmerich, who certainly was a good man, but I don't think had the experience that Chief Horton did.
We're most fortunate today to have with us Mr. Thomas O'Neill, owner and proprietor of that great store, O'Neill's, in Baltimore. Tell us, Mr. O'Neill, how did you get in this business in the first place?
Well, it's a great story, and thank you very much for asking. You see, I came over to Baltimore when I was 16 years old, sailing up the Chesapeake Bay with only pennies in my pocket. I got a job in a dry goods store, which I had done back in County Colvin in Ireland with my father. I worked in that store for many years, and then I started my own store with a partner. I ended up buying out that partner, and it became O'Neill's Dry Goods Store, the finest store south of Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. Yes, it was a fine store and people would come from all over. I was very much involved in that and made it a great and wonderful store that everyone would want to come to. In fact, I was known as the red-headed floor walker. People would come into the store and I would walk around. I would know everyone by name and I would greet them there. I was so glad to have them come to my store.
All of these splendid actions by your staff and yourself on that fateful day, do you attribute that to the skill of the men or to luck, or how did this all come about?
Oh, it was a horrible day, that February 7th, 1904, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The fire was spreading and I was worried about my store, but I knew what I had to do. I went to church and then I went to the Carmelite convent, where I got some of the nuns to pray for me to stop the fire from Baltimore and to save my store. Very important it was, and when I came back and some of my employees had come in from church or from their homes on that Sunday, and they had done many things. You see, I had a 15,000-gallon tank on the top of my roof. I had a Grinnell sprinkler system on the inside of my building with 955 sprinkler heads spread throughout. I had an outside water sprinkler system, and all of these things were in place. They stuffed the downspouts so that when they broke the tank, the roof filled, so the firebrands came over from other fires. They were able to put them out. Some of my fine lads worked well through the day and through the evening as the fire approached. It was very important, the things that we did. We had the sprinklers coming down the outside of the windows, and I only had a little bit of trouble on one of the cornices caught fire. And then the evening approached, and we all prayed together. We all came together to do whatever we could, and I knew the Carmelites were praying for me. Finally, the wind changed. The direction went off, and my building was spared. It was a fine time.
Thank you so much, Mr. O'Neill. You've added so much to the story. It's a great story, and your part of it is just splendid. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. It's been my privilege to come back and tell my story of the Great Baltimore Fire.
Today, to have as our guest William Donald Schaefer, a man who has devoted 50 years of his life to public service. When you were growing up in the 1920s and 1930s, that wasn't too far from 1904 and the Great Baltimore Fire. Did you hear your elders ever talk about this event?
Actually, I grew up in the 1950s. I'm a very young man. I just have this fake face on that looks all beat up. You know, there was very few people talked about the fire. It's just surprising. I didn't know about it for a long period of time. I guess the first real introduction, there was a man by the name of Peter R. Peterson, I think. He wrote a book. And I read this book, and I also listened to DVD, and I learned all about the fire. Yeah, so you think I didn't know anything? Yeah. In fact, I stood right in the middle where the fire started.
Holy
that was where that cow kicked the bucket over there.
No, that was Chicago.
Oh,
that was Chicago.
I didn't know that.
Robert M. McLean was the mayor in 1904, and he was Baltimore's youngest mayor. And during the fire, they couldn't find him. Where's the mayor? And there were mayors from far away as New York City calling, do you need any help? Do you need any help? Where's the mayor? I don't know. And lo and behold, he was out with the firemen running up and down the streets, just as you were talking about. He was out where the action was. But I think the proof of the pudding there is you need some sort of command and control. If you're the mayor, you've got to stay next to the communications and deal with what you've got to deal with.
Yes, they do.
Mayor McLean committed suicide about 3 months after the fire. And this dear man was suffering from a tremendous amount of stress of trying to reconstruct the city. 70 blocks burned to the ground. Now, when you were very much involved in Baltimore's renaissance of downtown and the inner harbor, did you have your good days and your bad days?
I would like to think that we had good days, mostly good days. We had the Greater Baltimore Committee, which was made up of the leading businessmen in the state of Maryland, mostly in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And they decided to tear out the inner city, downtown, rebuild it, and they did it. They did a super job on doing that.
Thank you so much, sir, for coming with us today. We appreciate it. We know you're a busy man as comptroller of the state of Maryland. You've got a lot of work to do.
Got a lot of money, too.
A lot of money, and can use a lot more.
Yeah.
But this discussion about the Great Baltimore Fire has just fascinated me for years, and I'm so glad that the book is out and published. And the first printing is sold out with 3,000 copies, and the second printing with 3,000 copies is going
That's
fast.
great.
And so, thank you so much for adding to what we're doing.
Thank you.
God bless you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm joined with a panel of experts who are going to deal with specific portions of the fire that they're familiar with. On the left is Wayne Schomburg, Baltimore historian. Immediately to the left of where I am is Tom Crane, Director of Interdisciplinary Studies, Johns Hopkins University. To my right is Steve Heaver, Director and Curator of the Fire Museum of Maryland. And on the far right is Gary Frederick, Assistant Fire Chief, retired, from the Baltimore Fire Department. The first question in this session is, would someone tell us about the one church that was destroyed in the Great Baltimore Fire? Just one of them, but there's a story that goes with us. Would someone jump in on that one?
Okay, the church in question is the Episcopal Church of the Messiah, and it was the only church lost in the fire. It was located at the corner of Fayette and Gay Streets, and the church burned early Monday morning, and it was right on the edge of the fire district. It turned out to be a total loss by the time the fire was over. The decided that they were going to rebuild on the same site. They proceeded to hire an architect and draw plans for the new church. And of course, the other thing they needed to do was raise money for the project. And they raised money in a rather unique way. In the church that burned, there was a steeple with a bell, and the bell came crashing down onto the floor of the church and broke into a number of pieces. And what they did was they took a couple of pieces of that bell around the corner to a nearby foundry, had the brass melted down and recast into souvenir bells that were about 3 inches high, and on the cross, the handle of the bell was the name of the church and the date of the fire. And they produced 2,800 of these bells, which they sold in Baltimore and around the country to raise the funds. And it's one of the collector's items from the Great Baltimore Fire. And people that I've talked to that have these, every one of these bells has a story associated with it. So anyway, they raised the money, they built the church, and the church operated on that corner from 1905, probably the end of 1905, 1906, up to the early 1920s. And by that time, the congregation had begun to move to the suburbs, and so the church did the natural thing, which was to move to the suburbs with their congregation. So the church moved, and today stands at the corner of Hartford Road and White Avenue, right in the middle of Hamilton.
Of the destruction of the Church of the Messiah, and that building is located right across from City Hall.
Right. The interesting thing that happened to that, the church moved to Parkville, longtime Baltimore movie theater. That's what the church became. It was and stood in that corner for a long time until eventually the theater closed and the building was demolished, and I believe the city government building went on there after that.
In your teaching of history courses, how do you Baltimore fire? How do you find that helpful in relating to students?
Baltimore had always prided itself on the fact that many of the subsequent news articles spoke to that effect. Again, this is theory, but accounts of the events of the day and thereafter, Jim Collins came across one that talked about someone having run off of a pier flames into the bay, and then a later article about a body that had washed up. It's quite possible that there was a death in this fire, and so the record gets changed after the fact. And this is a lesson about history. It's also a lesson about the ways in a city like Baltimore sees itself and identifies many other things I could say about this. It's, for example, the ways in which history, sociology, technology all come together. And we think that we're so smart that we have sprinkled department stores today, but until I listened to people, the fact that they also had one department. And so I think we think we are. And I'd say that that's what drew me to the fire in the first place. Is history is often taught in a fairly dry way. I think the colleges are studying history. I ask is how to precisely through a focus on something as riveting as a disaster, a fire, that you're watching real people deal with this crisis between and how we do today. I mean, 2001, so the natural comparisons between what happened in New York and what happened here make very, very interesting discussions, let's say.
Steve Heaver, in your Fire Museum of Maryland, how does history and visual displays and all of that, what's the...
We feel are the most important. In this case, we have one of the steamers that actually fought the fire, Engine 14, and we try to interpret that object to people that are so how you relate the old machine to some would have used the machine, all of those aspects. But we find that when you're talking about that you start with people, usually finish with people as well. Right. Ourselves as being the place beyond a for instance, and We have other pieces in our collection which, although they we have another piece at the beginning of the fire with the but we have could have been used at the fire, and so you might through which this fire and the type of firefighting that
Gary Frederick, in your career with the Baltimore, what is a part of lessons themselves?
Well, the fire service works as a management tool, the same as any other organization. Part of that management. Today where you have a real quickly and get things means of communication. One was a face-to-face run your instructions, tell your instructions to him. Chief Horton faced an enormous task. The building basically exploded, broke out windows in the adjacent building in a very short period of time. This way, when he made his walk around, as we call it, he was facing a major conflagration within 15 minutes. Here, they started putting the initial fire, started spreading. And when you're a fire chief, accepted budget City Hall, if at all possible. Stop it on the north end, right at City Hall. And a lot to do with the change of wind direction at that point in time. Fire towards the southeast. The park like all and Jones Falls. It would not stand alone without the assistance of Street. First. Pratt Street. frame combustion and ready to go at a minute's notice. There was a stop made over in that vicinity. Not to the Philadelphia Fire Department. There was a mixture of units, but Philadelphia was predominant. Because the fire hydrant problem, which usually sleeves. Or suction sleeves into the hardware. Order against the fire, which worked well. Jones Falls side of the fire with, but the winds were being driven towards them. In other words, Jones Falls in its Jones Falls, again ample supply, and throwing their streams against the wind was approaching them. And that's where they made the stand. Had it not been for that, they would have probably gone on into East Baltimore. Around or near the harbor and its tributary. Fire control at the point they did.
In support of what you're saying, west of Liberty Street, not far from the Johnny Hurst building, there are some old there, that's for sure. We've got pictures of it. District, you and then you get into the fragile panes and skylights and all.
A lot is the fact that that was the hottest 2100 degrees, right?
Yeah.
So all were really, substantially built. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of heat to impinge on any brick or whatever it is. And brick will deteriorate in a certain amount of heat. It'll start splashing. But yeah. The fact that there was two separate fires around the market. This was well beyond where the fire had extended into one gigantic fire. It started and went up to the north, then came down to the southeast. Substantially, burning against the wind. The fire.
To the Maryland Institute.
Yeah.
first buildings to go at
Right.
Market, yeah, and that was early on.
So, you know, people don't pick up on that. But the
That
fact-
Marsh Market was really held to pay earlier than other spots in that area. And then there were firebrands. Embers that traveled across the Jones Falls, and parts east of the Jones Falls did catch. Many people think that it just merely got to the Jones Falls and stopped.
I think the last building to burn was the ice company. Wasn't the Little Italy. These were, in other words, they sent
Yes.
engines. The stop was really made.
And after the fire, in many places, measures of embers and what have you in the weeks that followed. Spill first building. Neat story there. Tom. This is Tom Crane, who is very interested in the historical. What did we learn from all of that within that context?
Well, some of the things you've already touched on, I mean, maybe on a smaller level, that businesses are not destroyed when they're the building which houses the money or the artifact. There, I'd say, in terms of urban planning in this country, really began with the Great Fires of the late 19th. The cities began to look at preventive planning. Even the explanation for this cigar having been
Yes.
to a basement window,
Yes.
and having caught bales of hay or of clothes. We don't know that for a fact, and yet their own explanation for the cause of the lesson here is the way in which history literature. So there are fictional narratives, and then there are narratives which are presumably based upon actual facts. I think it's wonderful that we have see the equipment that was involved in putting out the fire, in spinning some kind of meaning or out. Let's say there's some embroidery. We don't.
Yes.
We sometimes don't distinguish between
Yes.
where the supposition and
Yes.
the imaginative recreation ends,
Yes.
and where the actual event.
Mr. Leary's cows is still under investigation.
Well, before the a discussion on his thoughts on why they picked on could repeat that.
Well, the only thing I could come up with was the whole rest of the building was gone, and the only thing left was the sidewalk, and the fact that they knew where the fire started because the company's 15 engine on the first alarm, you know, in the basement was taking place. Which proved the point again about the smoke going up the elevators. So that came as a summarization, I guess, to somebody. That's what's left.
Inference, and it can't be proven, but it's a bit of circumstantial evidence, right?
Well, the insurance adjusters, however, if I could speak on their defense, they're obviously, if they were alive today, they'd be. They met after the fire, and they had fire started, and they clearly, in their after-action report, said that the strong assumption of that, and they let it go at that. So you could take it or not.
Right.
It would be interesting to know in the sidewalk.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the firefighters put the hole in that dead eye with running.
They weren't there long enough to do that.
But if I remember correctly, I mean, what we do learn though is that you know, the leap from there is that the sidewalk was higher than these windows, and ultimately, well, maybe we shouldn't be building the sidewalks higher than the basement windows so that something like this could happen, whether it happened or not. And so it resulted in some ways, a redesign of how streets were laid.
Wayne, what do
The thing that you had touched on earlier, fire became an urban laboratory for other cities to. What happened? You know, with all due respect to Chicago, Chicago was barely 20 years old when it burned down. Baltimore's an established city. It's got a major modern downtown. So when this burned, people came from all over the country to see and look at the results. Daniel Burnham, who designed the Continental Trust building, showed up to check out the building that he had designed, the Continental Trust building. Other people came in to look at how different buildings survive. One of the issues, and Gary touched on it just briefly, was that many of these buildings had skylights, which is how the fire got in. Versus skylights made of what I call it a safety glass with the wire.
Glass.
And now again, right near, which burned because the fire got in through a skylight in the roof. Baltimore and Light Street was called. There's a very good photo taken from a higher building looking down. It's a fire survivor. It's a little highlight that looks like a greenhouse across safety glass and the fire. So people came to learn what had happened here in Baltimore. Architecture. The other thing that's mentioned, although were Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. He and 1904 report, which is on the Baltimore Park system. They had literally turned that over to the mayor the week before the fire. Asked him to come and make suggestions, and of course we know Olmsted for parks. None of that was really in his plans. He talked more about efficiency of moving traffic through downtown Baltimore, widening streets and doing this kind of thing. So we really become the urban laboratory to try and correct and make improvements.
Joining us today is Andy Blumberg, a man that I've known for some time, and as I was doing my research on the Great Baltimore Fire, I enjoyed chatting with him about the role of trolley cars during the Great Baltimore Fire. As a volunteer, Andy has been working with the Trolley Car Museum, and I'd like to ask Andy about his knowledge about trolley cars and the Great Baltimore Fire.
Thanks, Pete. I've been with the Baltimore Streetcar Museum for over 15 years now. One of the things I do with them is Director of Public Affairs, and plus run the streetcars on the weekends. And you're right, streetcars had a big role to play in the Great Fire. Specifically, the streetcars themselves were prohibited from entering the area of the fire where the conflagration was raging. Early on Sunday, that Sunday, it was, as you know, after the multiple alarms were sounded and people realized they had a very big fire in their hands, the lines were pulled back and streetcars could no longer go into that area. As far as I know, all the streetcars were pulled out of that area, and streetcars didn't burn, so they were able to save the cars, but there was a lot of damage to the overhead lines carrying electricity. Miles and miles of that was destroyed. The track was covered with wreckage of the buildings, and so the system was not in operation for a while, but it didn't take long, just several weeks, for that wreckage to be cleared, lines restored to at least to an extent, and cars to start running again. And in I'd say in March and April, early spring, it was a favorite activity for people to take a streetcar downtown and go through the burnt district and go through the ruins and take a look at the damage. Today, I'm sure that wouldn't be allowed because of insurance purposes and safety reasons, but it happened back then. The power plant today, where all the attractions are down in the Inner Harbor, was the United Railways and Electric Company generating plant. The streetcar company generated its own electricity, and that was, of course, as you have written about, that building was extensively damaged in the fire and was knocked offline for a while in terms of providing power. So that's a big part of the story too.
Power was cut off. That streetcars froze in place, and the motormen stayed there with their vehicles, and families would come and bring them food.
That's right. I think the idea with the company was that the car was your responsibility, and you were going to stay there to make sure that nothing untoward happened to it, any vandalism, any other things happening. So you had some dedicated crews, and their families would come and see how they were doing and bring them lunch or dinner or whatever for the time that those cars were immobilized. And as with everybody else, the fire caught everyone off guard, so the streetcar company, United Railways, did what it could to protect its property.
I'm amazed at the use of streetcars over 100 years ago, and the fact that in terms of public transportation, people really got around with those streetcars. And then also that there were, in some cases, amusement parks at the end of the line, so that on Sunday they could get some more fares from the folks that would go out to the park at the end of the line.
That's right. The companies were always looking for ways to make money, and they wanted people to ride not just during rush hours, but also to get their fares during weekends and evenings. So a lot of streetcar companies, not only in Baltimore but around the country, built amusement parks. And of course, not too coincidentally, just about the only way you could get to or from the park was by streetcar. So they had the fares pouring in on the weekends as well, especially in the summertime, especially.
One fire company did come to the Great Baltimore Fire via streetcar, and that was the folks from Dundalk. And I can just see them now. Without any fire equipment, they jump on a streetcar, maybe a broom or two to whack at the fire, and off they go. No engines, no fire engines at all. But that must have been a great spirit to ride along and get into the swing of things.
Oh, absolutely. It was the way to travel back then, and a generation before automobiles, and that was the way people got around. And when the streetcars didn't operate for a while after the fire, you know, people suffered because of it.
Thank you, Andy, for your thoughts.
Thank you, Pete.
With us today is former Mayor Tommy D'Alessandro's. We're located on the fringe of Little Italy in the Bella Nota restaurant. And not far from here is President Street, and back in 1904 was the location of the tail end of the Jones Falls. As you were growing up many years ago, like myself, I'm sure you heard the story of the Great Baltimore Fire many times, and in connection with it, the great story about St. Anthony and the intervention and the faith that goes along with that. Could you please relate that story?
Certainly. The Baltimore Fire was the greatest tragedy that ever hit this city since its inception. And when the fire first broke out, it was thought that it could be contained by the Baltimore City Fire Department, but it grew far beyond their expectation. So fire companies were coming in from as far away as New York and Philadelphia, all around the eastern coast. And they put up fire lines along Charles Street, and the fire just overwhelmed them. They had to drop back to Calvert Street, to St. Paul Street, and eventually they came here to President Street on the other side of the Jones Falls. Now, the Jones Falls appeared to be a natural barrier, the water flowing from the Jones Falls. But up until that time, the damage that was inflicted was strictly property damage. If that fire crosses the Jones Falls and keeps on going, it hits all of East Baltimore, which was heavily populated by immigrants, not only from Italian and Jewish and Irish and Polish ancestry, but German ancestry. It was an amalgamation of all the immigrants centered in East Baltimore. So at the Jones Falls, after failure at all those other streets, the firemen lined up in a fire line. Firemen from New York, from Washington, from Baltimore, from Philadelphia. They're on the bridges that cover the Jones Falls. They're on President Street. Everything was intact. But what happened this time? The Italian immigrants had been bunkered in St. Leo's Church, and they were praying to their favorite saint. At that time, most of the immigrants from Italy were St. Anthony's. They were praying for St. Anthony for a miracle. Some were even down on the line praying. And what happened at on the Jones Falls on President Street at that time, for some strange reason, we call it the miracle in the faith. These fire lines, these fire hoses began to work in synchrony, at full force. It didn't happen at the other streets. In full force, these fire hoses were throwing out their water. At the same time, the wind changed, which was a godsend. The wind changed. So the combination of the wind changing and the heavy concentration of the firemen and their fire hoses working at maximum capacity brought the fire to an end. We maintain that that was brought about by the intervention of St. Anthony. As since that date until today, around June the 13th, day of his birth, or his death, I forget, we celebrate this feast day. We celebrate it first with the Mass. That's always a important aspect of the celebration. After that comes a parade throughout the neighborhood, and followed now by the festival. And this has been going on ever since 1904.
One last indoor question. In the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s and then in the 60s when you were in office, what was politics like in those days? What were your observations? What were the trends? How were things like?
It was great. It was great. The city of Baltimore was overwhelmingly Democratic, so there was a lot of Democratic factional infighting. We organized every precinct in the city, and the opposition faction organized every precinct in the city. And we fought each other tooth and nail. We met around the clock, day in and day out. When the election was over, we would all sit down in one of the restaurants, either Horn and Horns or downtown somewhere, and get the results. Democrat, Republican, factionalist, we all sat around the table and we would tell about the different instances that took. It was great. It was great. Not like today. Today it's not comfortable. It's not comfortable. It's not politics as I know it. It's bad. It's bad. And I think this polarization that exists, if it doesn't break soon, it's going to lead to the decline of the power of this country. And that's how serious I think it's getting. It's getting bad. But in those days, friend or foe, we always sit down and break bread after the election. We always were cheerful with one another in their companies. They were intermarriages within the factions, and we go, election day, we stood our different parts, you know, we fought it out, we slugged it out. But it was organization at that time, organization. I mean, I was a precinct executive when I was 9 years old. I was a ward executive when I was 18 years old. District leader when I was about 22. I knew almost every political personality in my district, friend and foe, every clergyman, every person of significance in the district. You had to know all that. Today, I'm lucky if I know my next door neighbor. It's altogether different.
Thanks for sticking with us, folks. This is the end of our documentary. If you'd like further information, buy the book, The Great Baltimore Fire, available at any bookstore and also online. Thanks for sticking with us. It's been a lot of fun, and I enjoyed explaining this great event and all of the conditions that went along with it. Bye-bye.